What kind of writer do you want to be? This seems like a simple question, but I recently found myself thinking about this, and honestly, the answer has changed how I look at my current book and the revision process as a whole. If you're struggling to feel satisfied with a first draft, maybe even a second or third, this video is for you. And let me explain. I recently got back a paid editorial analysis of my latest novel, an adult paranormal fantasy thriller, and that came from a professional editor. Needless to say, the process of getting a professional opinion on my work has been an absolute experience. It's been a roller coaster of emotions with highs and lows. I'd love to make another video solely about revisions and hiring a professional editor, but I'm not going to go too deep into that here. For now, I just want to kind of tell enough to set the stage for where my headspace has been the past few days and why this question of what kind of writer do I want to be has been on my mind. When I handed over my manuscript, to be honest, I felt fairly confident in my writing and the story. I felt like it was some of the best work that I had done to date. When I got back the analysis from the editor, I immediately sensed mixed feelings. On one hand, she praised my writing as strong, even commented on sections saying they were poetic and beautifully written. But on the other hand, she had plenty of critiques, especially for plot choices and moments that she felt were just hampering the pacing. A lot of this feedback was really good, and when I read it, I could tell, yeah, that's obviously something that I should listen to and consider. But there were also moments when my mindset was to push back and to say, nope, I'm going to trust my intuition. I felt like she just didn't really like some of the creative risks that I was taking in the story, which in my mind was what set me apart. And maybe that's true. As they say, it only takes one yes in publishing, sort of. If you get a yes from an agent, you also have to get a yes from an editor at a publishing house if you're going the traditional route. And even then, that acquisitions editor probably has to go get approval from superiors. So in a way, you need a trail of yeses, which means the bigger risks you're taking, the harder it's going to be to convince everybody in the room that the answer should be yes. Anyways, I let that feedback sink in over a few days, and after enough time to really let it sink in, I started to wonder if I was jeopardizing my chances of being published by choosing to stick to certain choices. In my original manuscript, there's a time jump of 17 years between part 1 and part 2. Such a big gap, it makes part 2 feel like a second book. All the tension that I built up in part 1 dissipates, then slowly ramps up again, culminating in a greater conclusion that ties both parts together. Here's the problem. As an unknown writer, I am also trying to adhere to industry standard word lengths as best as I can. And for my genre, that means shooting around 100,000 words max. If I was a big writer who could publish 180,000 word novels, I think the timeline jump could work and be very effective. But chances are I'll have a much harder time selling a book that large as an unknown writer. At first, I was frustrated by this, but then I asked myself that single question: what kind of writer do you want to be? In my mind, the creative risk I was taking in the first draft was artsy. It was creative, poetic, even literary for those who could pick up on the subtleties of it. But when you consider the genre and overall style of my prose and plot, I'm clearly writing speculative fiction, not literary fiction. And if I'm not trying to be a hyper-literary author, why am I trying to do hyper-literary things in my paranormal fantasy novel? I think it's okay to be unique and do things different. But for a writer like me who just wants to entertain with my writing, I need to take that into account when I actually write. I realized my editor was probably onto something that was generally correct. So now I have a big choice to make. Do I make a major edit to part 2 of my story not only shaving off 25,000 or more words in the process, but also making my story adhere to more typical pace and progression for my genre. I did an excellent job raising stakes and pulling readers into the story in part 1, only to subvert the plot on them at the end of that part unexpectedly. Instead, I could condense the timeline, allow the stakes presented at the end of part 1 to naturally carry into part 2, thus, culminating in a shorter story, sure, but probably maintaining a more expected pacing. So how do we interpret this as writers, as artists? Is making this decision betraying my creativity? I don't think so. It's coming to terms with the reality of publishing. I've come to the conclusion that making the edits is the safest bet. It's understanding that if I want to be a traditionally published mainstream genre fiction writer, then I need to play by the guidelines of mainstream genre fiction writers, where it matters most, at least until I've built a track record of sales. If you decide that's not what you want, you'd rather stick to your own vision or trust your gut, self-publish, or pursue a more literary classification in your writing, I think that's okay. That's awesome. At least for me, I had to come to understand that if I'm writing paranormal fantasy, most readers are going to expect paranormal fantasy, not literary fiction. Once I was clear about my goals and the kind of writer that I want to be, I realized my job is purely to entertain. While I'll always continue to strive for poetic and beautifully written prose when I can, I don't want that to get in the way of simply writing an entertaining story. So, what do you think? Do you agree with my decision to abandon parts of my original vision that was probably a little more creative but risky in order to adhere to genre expectations? And in the world of self-publishing, do you feel pursuing trad publishing and having to make some of these concessions is a good thing, or maybe not? I would love to know your thoughts and comments on these questions and everything I've brought up in this video down below. If you liked the video, please give me a like or a dislike if you hated it. As a small channel, your subscriptions mean the world to me. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, I'm Stephen Clark. Right on.